reminder. That's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edith.
Other questions? Okay, well then this application is certified. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the fourth item on our agenda is a certification of special permits, zoning text amendment, and disposition of city-owned property in Manhattan Community District 5. Our presenter is Ezra Moser.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Ezra Moser. This is an application by Commodore Owner LLC, which is a joint venture between RXR Realty and TF Cornerstone for a new office and hotel development in East Midtown. Next slide, please. So the applicant's requesting 4 special permits, a text amendment, and a disposition of non-residential city property in order to facilitate a Class A office building and a hotel in East Midtown within Manhattan's Community District 5. They're using a number of East Midtown special permits with some tweaks to the text to allow for the scale and unique location of the proposed development, as well as the size of their public improvement package. The requested special permits are to allow use group 5 hotel use, which would result in a 500 key transient hotel, to allow a 3 FAR bonus for the provision of transit improvements, to allow a 1.27 FAR bonus for the provision of public concourse spaces, and to modify various East Midtown bulk provisions. Next slide, please. So the proposed development would contain 2.25 million square feet of office and hotel floor area. It would rise to 1,642 feet, and it would have approximately 85 stories. It would undertake significant transit improvements and would also create a brand new transit hall for Grand Central Terminal. Additionally, it would provide 25,000 square feet of outdoor public space in the form of 3 elevated terraces that would wrap around the building and offer brand new views of the surrounding area. The proposed transit improvements would generate 611,000 square feet of bonus floor area, and the various public spaces requested under the public concourse special permit would generate 259,000 square feet of bonus floor area. Next slide, please. So here's the general order of the presentation. We're going to review the background and site conditions, then we'll discuss the public realm improvements, and then go through the building's design and the requested waivers. We will cover the text amendments and the requested actions last. Next slide, please. So to start, we'll quickly go through the site's background and existing conditions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So the proposed development site is located at 175 Park Avenue. Oh, no, can we go back, please? Thank you. So it's located at 175 Park Avenue on a super block bounded by 42nd Street, Lexington Avenue, Vanderbilt Avenue, and East 45th Street. The Park Avenue viaduct bisects the block and provides north-south vehicular access across it. It's located directly adjacent to Grand Central Terminal and across Lexington Avenue from the Chrysler Building. It's located within a C53 district within the Grand Central Transit Improvement Zone sub-area of the East Midtown subdistrict, which has a base FAR of 15. This can be increased up to 27 through the subdistricts as of right mechanisms, and then 30 via special permit. Next slide, please. So the East Midtown subdistrict was established in 2017 in order to facilitate a new generation of state-of-the-art Class A office towers. The map that you see on the left shows the location of the subdistrict within the special Midtown district, and then the map on the right shows the subdistrict with its various sub-areas. And the development site is outlined in red on both slides. Under the East Midtown regulations, sites that meet certain criteria are termed qualifying sites and are eligible to increase their maximum permitted FAR via a series of chair certifications. To jog everyone's memory, these include district-wide transfer of landmark floor area through the completion of pre-identified transit improvements in the public right-of-way, or for buildings that were built before 1961 through the reconstruction of overbuilt floor area. Once developments achieve their maximum permitted FAR through these as of right mechanisms, they can increase their floor area by another 3 FAR up to a total of 30. via 2 special permits for the provision of either site-specific transit improvements or by providing a public concourse. So just as a quick reminder to everybody, a public concourse is a public space that can be either indoors or outdoors. Next slide, please. So 175 Park Avenue is currently occupied by the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is the blue and glass-clad building you can see on the right. As you can probably see from this picture, it's directly adjacent to Grand Central, which is East Midtown's primary transit hub. This is a view looking northeast along 42nd Street. The Grand Hyatt was formerly known as the Commodore Hotel. It was built in 1919 as part of Terminal City. And as a bit of background, in 1977, the Empire State Development Corp's predecessor, the UDC, adopted a GPP to renovate the Commodore, and then they ground leased it to a private developer for a 99-year term. So then the hotel was gut renovated, reskinned with the dark reflective glass that you see here, and reopened as the Grand Hyatt. Next slide, please. So here's the Hyatt viewed from the opposite direction at the corner of 42nd and Lexington Avenue looking west. Next slide, please. So here you can see the development site in orange, side by side with the Grand Central Terminal zoning lot in blue. The development site is block 1280 lot 30 and is currently improved with the Grand Hyatt. It has 275 feet of frontage along 42nd Street and then 208 feet of frontage along Lexington Ave. It has a total lot area of 57,000 square feet. The adjacent Grand Central Terminal zoning lot is colored in blue, and it's comprised of lots 154 and 154, which contain the terminal structure and Grand Central Market. It also includes a series of subterranean transmit parcels, as well as an air rights lot. The air rights lot actually was purchased by an affiliate of the applicant in 2017. That zoning lot has 146,500 square feet of lot area. So the applicant is requesting a text amendment to allow the orange lot and the blue lot to form a single qualifying site under the East Midtown regulations. Combined, the qualifying site would have 203,872 square feet of lot area. So this results in a larger bonus and a larger building than would otherwise be permitted, but it also facilitates a much larger site-specific package of public realm improvements. Additionally, this allows the proposed development to use 618,000 square feet of Grand Central's unused air rights, subject to a roughly $38 million contribution into the East Midtown Public Realm Improvement Fund. Next slide, please. So here's an elevation view of the qualifying site as viewed from 42nd Street. It extends avenue to avenue, and as I noted, is bisected by the Park Avenue Viaduct. Next slide, please. And here's an elevation from Lexington Avenue. The qualifying site includes the Grand Central Market Building, which will remain. Next slide, please. So Grand Central accommodates 750,000 visitors per day, and this image is one that we're all familiar with. Next slide, please. As we also know from experience, its transit and pedestrian network can be extremely congested and confusing to navigate. Next slide, please. The development site, which here is highlighted in orange, is closely integrated with Grand Central Terminal and has multiple levels of its transit infrastructure directly below it. The subway mezzanine, which is highlighted in green, occupies nearly 30,000 square feet of the below-grade footprint, which is more than half the development site's area. Next slide, please. Additionally, there are multiple layers of track infrastructure below that, including the Lexington Avenue platform, which is highlighted in green, and Metro North tracks, which are labeled with an arrow. As you can see, the Flushing Line platform, which is highlighted in purple, runs at the edge of the development site's footprint. Additionally, the development site is directly adjacent to the terminus of both Metro North and the future LIRR terminus highlighted in yellow. This extraordinary level of integration presents a number of structural challenges for redevelopment, as well as opportunities for significant on-site transit improvements. Next slide, please. So at grade, the development site is similarly integrated with Grand Central Terminal's infrastructure. The Lexington Passage runs east to west across the site, providing access from Lexington Avenue to the terminal's main hall. 3 subway entrances are located on the development site. The largest is the 42nd Street entrance, which is also known as R238. which you can see towards the bottom left of the development site. It's accessed actually from inside the 42nd Street passage. So if you were to try to access this entrance from the street, you'd have to enter the 42nd Street passage and then turn about 180 degrees to your right. The Lexington Avenue entrance provides access from Lexington Avenue down to the subway mezzanine, and it's also known as R239, or more colloquially, the Strawberry Stair. It was widened and improved recently as part of One Vanderbilt suite of transit improvements. Then lastly, as you see closer to the top of the development site, there is the Lexington Passage entrance, which is also known as R240, and this connects the Lexington Passage directly to the subway mezzanine. So just to reiterate, the site features 3 prominent entrances to the subway and has a major east-west pedestrian corridor running through its ground floor. And now to familiarize you with the site further, I'll briefly show photos of 2 of those subway entrances, which the applicant proposes to renovate and expand as part of the proposed development. Next slide, please. So these are photos of the 42nd Street subway entrance, which is the one that can only be accessed from inside the 42nd Street passage in the terminal. The photo on the left is the entrance as experienced from the subway mezzanine, and the right image shows the entrance at grade. Next slide, please. Here's the Lexington Avenue entrance as viewed from the street. It's referred to as the Strawberry Stair because of its proximity to the former Strawberries retail establishment, which is slightly visible to its left under that Grand Hyatt sign. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to provide a broad overview of the public realm improvements, and then following that, I'll delve into the details. So next slide, please. This is a quick preview of the proposed building's design as viewed in elevation from 42nd Street. Its design and form are largely driven by the complexity of its below-grade conditions and the limited opportunities for terra firma, which we'll discuss in more detail later in the presentation. The columns have to land at key locations in order to thread between various parts of the below-grade transit infrastructure. However, this close integration presents the opportunity for a number of site-specific and once-in-a-generation upgrades to the public realm. So again, I will give over the following slides an overview of these proposed upgrades level by level, and then following that in 2 separate sections, I'll dive into the details of each improvement. Next slide, please. Below grade, the proposed development will create a new multimodal connector named the Short Loop. This will provide a new 3-way connection between the Long Island Railroad East Side Access Terminal, the Metro North, and the subway mezzanine. As seen on the right-hand side of the image, the proposed development will expand and rationalize a subway mezzanine by removing a series of girders. As you'll see in the next slide as well, the proposed development will completely overhaul the 42nd Street entrance, which will also expand the mezzanine and make for a dramatically improved user experience. All the improvements seen here are part of the 81,644 transit improvement bonus, which is why they are shaded in blue. Next slide, please. At grade, seen here, the proposed development would undertake 4 major improvements. 1, it would renovate the Lexington Passage and make it double height. This is seen in green along the northerly edge of the development site. 2, it would create a brand new transit hall, providing a 3-way connection between the Lexington Passage, the 42nd Street Passage, and the subway station. The transit hall is visible in green, running along the west or left-hand side of the development site. 3, as I discussed on the previous slide, it would dramatically expand and improve the 42nd Street subway entrance, which is seen in blue just south of the transit hall. And then 4, it would relocate and refurbish the Lexington Avenue entrance as seen along the easterly edge in blue. These are color coded to show that the 2 new subway entrances are part of the section 81,644 transit bonus, depicted in blue, and that the transit hall and Lexington Passage are part of the 81,645 public concourse, which is depicted in green. Next slide, please. Above grade, the proposed development would create a multi-level series of connected public terraces, which will also be detailed later in the presentation. As per the color coding, 2 of these spaces, which are seen in green, are sought as part of the section 81,645 public concourse bonus, and 1, which is seen in yellow, is a mandatory public space under the East Midtown regulations. Next slide, please. So now I'll move through these improvements in detail, starting with the below grade transit upgrades. Next slide, please. So here's the short loop connector in the context of the full suite of transit improvements. The short loop is a once-in-a-generation improvement that would transform an abandoned railroad track into a direct connection between Metro North's lower platform level, the future East Side Access Concourse, which you can see in the far top left-hand side of the screen, and then the subway mezzanine. The mezzanine here is shown in green. Under current conditions, Metro North commuters arriving on those lower platforms must travel up to grade and through the terminal complex before traveling back down below grade again to access the subway mezzanine. Future Long Island Railroad commuters would similarly be required to take escalators up into 1 Vanderbilt's transit hall before making their way back down to the subway mezzanine by the shuttle passageway in Grand Central Terminal. As currently designed, both users for both the Metro North and the Long Island Railroad are required to take circuitous and inefficient routes to access the subway, which the short loop would address. So the abandoned railroad track that will be transformed is located at approximately the same elevation as both the East Side Access Concourse level and those lower level Metro North tracks. And it would be turned into a pedestrian walkway that would provide users for both of these terminuses direct access to the subway mezzanine. As it moves east, the walkway would gradually slope upwards and then connect to the mezzanine via a stair and an ADA elevator. Overall, it would save users a travel distance of 40 vertical feet. Also, by increasing exit points from the commuter rail platforms, it would help reduce congestion in other parts of the terminal. Next, we will discuss the improvements to the mezzanine itself. So next slide, please. So the applicant would remove multiple girders and empty back of house spaces from the mezzanine level of the Grand Central 42nd Street subway station, which you can see here in various shades of green. Next slide, please. Removing these girders would add over 2,600 square feet of circulation space and allow for new turnstiles at the mezzanine's northern end. The mezzanine would be transformed from the labyrinth that we all know today into a more legible space with very clear sight lines. The removal of these obstructions and the new sight lines would redistribute passengers from visible but congested platform stairs to ones that are currently obscured and underutilized. Next slide, please. Since there was a lot of information on these two slides, I'm going to show them again. So here's the existing mezzanine, again with the girders highlighted in green. Then next slide, please. Here's the same view in the proposed condition with the girders removed. You can see how much more open and streamlined it is. And now I will show some before and after renderings just to add a little emphasis. Next slide, please. So here's an existing view looking north along the mezzanine. The girders are visible as the white colored wall that you can see kind of in the foreground on the left, and then a black truss behind it and to the right. Next slide, please. Here's how it would look in the proposed conditions with the girders removed. Notice the improved sight lines down the mezzanine. Next slide, please. So there's also a lot to see. I'm going to show it again. Here is the existing conditions with the girders blocking sight lines. And then next slide. Here it is in the proposed conditions with the girders removed. Not only is the mezzanine more legible, but it becomes easier to navigate. Next slide, please. Here's another existing conditions view at the northern end of the mezzanine. And again, this white wall and kind of in the middle of the shot is one large girder. Next slide, please. Here's how that same view would look in the proposed conditions, revealing actually the relocated strawberry stair entrance kind of in the center of the screen. Next slide. So I'm going to show the same before after sequence again for emphasis. Here is the existing conditions view at the northern end of the mezzanine, and next slide. Here it is in the proposed conditions with the girders removed. Next slide, please. So moving back up to grade, this slide shows the ground level under existing conditions. Next slide, please. This shows it under the proposed conditions from the same perspective. You can see the degree to which the proposed development would expand the footprint of Grand Central Terminal's infrastructure onto the development site. This slide highlights the integration between the proposed transit hall and the expanded 42nd Street subway entrance, both of which are stacked to the westerly side of the development site. Additionally, the proposed transit hall would remove large portions of the wall separating it from the 42nd Street passage. This slide also shows the relocation expansion of the Lexington Avenue entrance on the right-hand side of the image. And I'd note that the building's street walls, you can kind of see here, would be set back from both Lexington and 42nd Street, expanding the effective width of those sidewalks. Overall, key takeaways: the public realm will constitute a significant portion of the proposed development's ground floor. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the 42nd Street subway entrance, which you see here in its existing conditions. It could be argued that it's cramped, confusing, and it's not exactly visible from the street. Next slide, please. In the proposed conditions, it would be enlarged from 900 to 2,400 square feet and would be given a prominent view directly from 42nd Street, which you can see here. Next slide, please. Here's a closer view of that entrance. It would be surrounded by transparent ground floor street wall materials that would bring natural light and new sight lines into both the ground floor and mezzanine space below. Next slide, please. Here's a view of the new entrance from inside looking out to 42nd Street. Next slide, please. Here's a view from inside the transit hall looking at the new entrance. So turnstiles would be relocated from the mezzanine level up to the ground floor, which would increase the mezzanine level's paid zone by about 3,500 square feet and relieving congestion and improving circulation. Placing the turnstiles here at grade, as you can see, will also help clearly indicate the subway entrance to users within the terminal. Next slide, please. So the existing ADA elevator for this entrance, which is highlighted in red, currently occupies one of the historic bays of the 42nd Street passage. In the proposed conditions, the elevator will be relocated from the new subway into the new subway entrance. And this will allow the 42nd Street passage to be open to its full original width and will expand its entry capacity by 33%. Next slide, please. So here's a rendering of the proposed conditions with the widened entrance to the 42nd Street passage and that newly opened bay highlighted again in red. The new subway entrance is clearly visible to the left. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show the before after sequence again. Here is the existing condition with the ADA elevator blocking about 1/3 of the 42nd Street passage's entrance. Next slide, please. And then here it is again in the proposed conditions with the passage fully open to its original width. And I removed the red highlight so that you can fully appreciate the perspective. Much of the wall separating the 42nd Street passage from the subway entrance would be opened up, revealing the new subway entrance. Next slide, please. The proposed conditions would dramatically improve vertical circulation as well. An existing stair would be relocated, widened, and daylit so as to reduce congestion. And then additionally, as you can see in this image, there would be a new 14-foot wide stair that would also be daylit from the street. You can see the relocated ADA elevator to the right of the stairs. Next slide, please. Here's an existing conditions photo of the entrance where it meets the mezzanine. In the current conditions, the escalators and the stairs run right next to each other, which causes congestion as they meet this mezzanine level and bump into the fare arrays, which again are located on the mezzanine in current conditions. Next slide, please. Here's a similar view in the proposed conditions. You can see how the stairs have been relocated away from the escalators and the fare array has been redistributed to the upper floors, both of which would ease bottlenecks. Now we will move on to the Lexington Avenue entrance. Next slide, please. So here's the Lexington Avenue entrance in its existing condition, which is just north of the corner of 42nd Street and Lex. Next slide, please. In the proposed conditions, the entrance and ADA elevator would be relocated to the northerly half of the development site's Lexington frontage. It would also be enlarged to 870 square feet and receive a weather-protected entrance area. The new entrance can be seen on the left with subway signage. And then, just for orientation, to its right are stairs to the terrace above it. Then to the right of that is the new Lexington Passage entrance, which I'll go over in a minute. And then to the right of Lexington Passage is an ADA elevator up to the terrace above. Next slide, please. Here's another more direct view of the new Lexington Avenue subway entrance. The ADA elevator associated with it is visible on the right. And the new entrance would allow natural light to penetrate down to the mezzanine and would actually improve circulation below grade by leading passengers to enter and exit the station on the mezzanine's center line. In its current conditions, the entrance is perpendicular to the primary flow of passengers, which causes congestion as people cut across the primary flow to access it. We'll now move on to the proposed transit hall. Next slide, please. Seen here in section view, the new transit hall would be 5,300 square feet and would improve pedestrian circulation and wayfinding between the terminal and subway station. It would be seamlessly integrated with the new 42nd Street entrance, visible on the left-hand side of the image, and the renovated Lexington Passage, which you can see on the right. It would have generous ceiling heights and would feature 3 skylights, one of which would be extruded and would provide a view of Grand Central Terminal's facade. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the transit hall. You can clearly see its direct sight lines to the new 42nd Street subway entrance. And then as you can see on the left-hand side of the image, retail would line its easterly side. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the transit hall facing more or less the other way. You can see the skylights and the view of Grand Central Terminal's easterly facade. Now we'll move on to the Lexington Passage. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of the passage in its existing conditions. It's an east-west corridor that provides direct access from Lexington Ave to Grand Central's main concourse and runs across the development site's ground floor. Next slide, please. Here it is in the proposed conditions looking towards Grand Central's main concourse. The passage would be renovated and have its ceiling height increased from 9'6" up to 18 feet. This would bring natural light into the space and improve its legibility for users. Next slide, please. So here it is in the proposed conditions looking out towards Lexington Avenue. As with the transit hall, this would be considered a bonus generating public concourse. Next slide, please. Here's Lexington Passage's exterior in its existing conditions. As most of us know from experience, it's difficult to identify its presence from the street. Next slide, please. Here it is in that same view in the proposed conditions. And as you can see, the passage would be clearly identifiable and would feature bright, transparent materials. Next slide, please. Now I will review the proposed public terraces. Next slide, please. So as we touched on earlier, the building's design and form are largely being driven by its below-grade conditions and the limited opportunities for terra firma. To redevelop, columns have to be threaded between commuter rail tracks and MTA infrastructure. In particular, structural columns would have to be bundled to land at the only 2 points along East 42nd Street where mega columns could be located on terra firma. You can see these as the particularly large red columns located towards 42nd Street. Next slide, please. So the building's superstructure has to pinch inwards at the base in order to land at these mega columns, which creates a number of unique opportunities for the base's design. The proposed development would align its single-story plinth with that of Grand Central at about 26 feet above curb level. The plinth would provide space for the creation of 3 elevated open-air public terraces, which I will detail shortly. And these are located above the plinth and are visible just above the red arrows that appear to pinch inwards. Next slide, please. So the 3 terraces would have a combined area of 25,000 square feet. Moving clockwise from the left, we have the Grand Central Terrace, the GRAYBAR Terrace, and then the CHRYSLER Terrace. Under East Midtown regulations, the proposed development is required to provide a mandatory 10,000 square foot unenclosed public space, which the CHRYSLER Terrace will satisfy. The applicant is also providing the Grand Central Terrace and GRAYBAR Terrace in addition to that, which have 15,400 square feet of area and are seeking a floor area bonus under the 81-645 public concourse special permit. Vertical circulation is highlighted in blue, and as you can see in the image, the 3 spaces are tiered and connected so they can be navigated in continuous fashion. Along East 42nd Street, 2 grand stairs would emerge from the center of the development site and would rise in opposite directions to provide access to the terraces. A secondary set of stairs on Lexington provides access to the CHRYSLER Terrace. Each terrace is ADA accessible and the respective elevators are highlighted in pink. In most instances, the agency's position is that elevated public spaces are not appropriate. However, in this case, with such a crowded high volume streetscape and where you have the opportunity for unique viewing platforms and new vantage points, we felt that this would be both a unique and appropriate public space typology. You know, we have examples like the elevated acre or the High Line where being above grade can feel really special. And so the agency is not concerned that its elevated nature is going to render it an underutilized or unsafe space. All 3 spaces are subject to PDC review and input. And the next stage of PDC review will take place after the City Council phase of ULURP. Were the project to be approved, the applicant would return to DCP following both the ULURP process and PDC review to finalize the designs for all 3 terraces. Final approval of all 3 terrace designs would actually be made via CPC chair actions. The guidelines for this process are outlined in the draft restrictive deck. And I note the chair commits to the final design being presented to the commission at that future date prior to final sign off. Next slide, please. So the terraces would be accessed from 42nd Street by a pair of grand civic stairs that would rise 26 feet. Each stair would have a width of approximately 19.5 feet and a run of 78 feet. 3 landings ranging from 11 to 13 feet deep would allow users moments of pause to appreciate views along East 42nd Street. Next slide, please. Here's a plan view of the 3 terraces and their programming. Again, we have the Grand Central Terrace on the west, which is the left side of the screen, the GRAYBAR Terrace to the north, and the CHRYSLER Terrace to the east. Each space has slightly different programmatic themes, but they generally allow for a variety of passive activities and provide opportunities for unique views of the surrounding area. I'll go through each plaza in further detail over the following slides. All 3 terraces would feature rotating art installations, which are represented by the blue asterisks. And an 8-foot wide circulation path would allow for circulation through all 3 terraces. I'd like to flag that the applicant would like to close the GRAYBAR Terrace overnight between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. and would like to close the Grand Central and CHRYSLER Terraces for nightly cleaning between 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. Next slide, please. So the 7,300 square foot Grand Central Terrace would be located 26 feet above grade and would provide brand new up close views of the terminal's eastern facade. I'd note that this view is rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise, as you can tell from the map key in the top left corner. The terrace would be anchored by 3 skylights, which you can see in pale blue, which would provide daylight to the transit hall below. There would be a southerly seating area with fixed benches and trees and a balcony-like alcove to the north that would feature a variety of seating types. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the space from the southerly end looking north. You can use the key again in the top left corner to orient yourself. You can see the variety of seating and planting types in the foreground. And then on the right towards the end of the plaza, you can clearly see stairs and an ADA elevator, which provide access up to the GRAYBAR Terrace. Next slide, please. Here's another view looking north from a different angle. And as you can see on the right, there's direct access from the building's lobby to the terrace. Next slide, please. Here's a view from the northern end of the plaza looking south towards 42nd Street. You can see the alcove area in the foreground. Next slide, please. Here's another view looking south, this time from the steps connecting the Grand Central Terrace to the GRAYBAR Terrace. Next slide, please. The 8,000 square foot GRAYBAR Terrace would connect the Grand Central Terrace to the CHRYSLER Terrace and would rise an additional 16 feet above them both. It would be 42 feet above curb level and would provide new elevated views of both Grand Central and then the landmarks along Lexington Avenue. The GRAYBAR Terrace would contain a number of amenities offering passive use of the space and could accommodate public programming and cultural events. A clear glass food and drink kiosk would be located at the center of the terrace so that the space remains active and inviting year-round. Viewing platforms would be located at the eastern and western ends of the terrace. The space would feature extensive bench seating, movable tables and chairs, and a large communal table with movable seating. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the GRAYBAR Terrace from its eastern half, looking west towards Grand Central. You can see the food and drink kiosk in the foreground, which anchors the terrace. Next slide, please. Here's a similar view from further west, and you can see the prominent view of Grand Central's facade and the variety of seating on the terrace's western half. Next slide, please. Here's the easterly half of the GRAYBAR Terrace, looking out towards Lexington Ave and the CHRYSLER building. You can see the communal table and viewing platforms on the right-hand side of the image. Next slide, please. Here's a view from the easterly viewing platform looking at the CHRYSLER Terrace below and then the CHRYSLER building to the left. You can see a high top table and chairs in the foreground. Next slide, please. The mandatory 10,000 square foot CHRYSLER Terrace would be the largest of the proposed development's 3 public terraces. Seen here, it's rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise. It would be anchored by a centrally located reflecting pool, which would be surrounded by movable tables and chairs. It would feature groves of high branching trees, bench seating, 2 viewing balconies, and a food and beverage retail establishment at its northern end. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the Chrysler Terrace looking south towards 42nd Street. You can see the reflecting pool in the foreground, and then access to building lobby can be seen on the right. Next slide, please. Here's another rendering of the reflecting pool looking east towards the Chrysler building. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the terrace looking south, which highlights the elevated views of the surrounding landmarks. Next slide, please. Here's a view from the southern viewing balcony with the Socony Mobile building featuring prominently in the background. Next slide, please. Lastly, here's a food and beverage retail space on the northerly end of the terrace. The northern viewing platform can be seen on the right. Next slide, please. Given the multi-level nature of the public terraces, the applicant will provide detailed wayfinding signage to help the public access the terraces. The details would be finalized post-ULURP were the project to be approved. The version depicted here is purely illustrative, and we welcome feedback from the Commission. We also note that PDC has jurisdiction over the wayfinding too. Next slide, please. So now we'll quickly go through the proposed building in its context. Next slide, please. Here's an elevation in context, viewed from 42nd Street. The building will set back from the street line 5 feet on both 42nd and Lex, and would rise to 1,642 feet and approximately 85 stories. Floor plates would range from 34,000 to 50,000 square feet, and floor to floor heights would range from 14 to 20 feet. Next slide, please. The proposed development's core would set back from the street line and would be aligned with the terminal's setback from 42nd Street. The stone cladding of the proposed development's plinth and its core would reference the color spectrum of granite and limestone seen in the terminal on the left. As mentioned earlier, the structural columns are bundled to land at the only 2 points along 42nd Street where mega columns can be located on terra firma, which creates this parting of the curtains effect on the facade. Next slide, please. A key advantage of this massing is that the parting of the columns allows for improved views of Grand Central Terminal from 42nd Street. Next slide, please. The building would provide a series of 4 10-foot setbacks, eventually forming a porous woven crown approximately 60 feet tall. As you can see here, the crown's design is intended to reference the lattice of the base. Next slide, please. Here's a view of the proposed development from 42nd Street looking east. This view emphasizes its relationship with Grand Central when viewed from this direction. One Vanderbilt can be seen in the foreground to the left. Next slide, please. Here's a closer view of the development from 42nd Street looking east. Next slide, please. Here's a similar view, but from 42nd Street, but looking west in the other direction. Next slide, please. This shows the proposed building's base viewed from the intersection of 42nd Street and Lex looking west. This is the Lexington Avenue portion of the office lobby entrance. Next slide, please. Here's a rendering of the proposed development in context. Next slide, please. Now we will briefly go over the requested waivers. Next slide, please. So pursuant to 81-685 and 81-645, the applicant would be seeking a number of waivers to various provisions of the East Midtown Subdistrict regulations in order to facilitate the proposed building. These are listed below or on the slide. Next slide, please. So the proposed development requires modifications to the qualifying site regulations in order to form a single qualifying site with Grand Central's zoning lot and utilize the unused floor area from the terminal. Next slide, please. So the Modifications to the East Midtown floor area provisions are required to allow the proposed development to increase its floor area via the 2 bonus special permits instead of the as of right framework. Next slide, please. The proposed development requires modifications to the street wall regulations in order to facilitate the proposed design and to allow space for the elevated public terraces. Next slide, please. The development also seeks height and setback waivers to facilitate the building's massing, design, and floor plates. Next slide, please. The development requires modifications to 3 of the Special Midtown District's plan elements. This includes max permitted lobby and entrance lengths, which you can see here. Next slide, please. It also includes modifications of the retail frontage requirements along 42nd Street in Lexington. Next slide, please. And it also includes modifications to the maximum length and depth of building entrance recess areas. Next slide, please. Additionally, the applicant is requesting a reduction in required loading bursts, which would facilitate the provision of the GRAYBAR terrace. Next slide, please. The applicant is requesting a waiver of the mandatory public space design requirements in order to allow for the provision of the elevated CHRYSLER terrace. In lieu of the regulations that would normally apply, the applicant is setting forth detailed bespoke design requirements for the space in the restrictive deck. Next slide, please. Lastly, the applicant is requesting a modification to 1142A to allow a single 10-year term to complete substantial construction. A term of 10 years is often given to multi-building developments, and in this case, the request reflects the unprecedented complexity of the site conditions and the need for careful long-term coordination with MTA in order to complete the transit improvements. Next slide, please. I'll provide a quick summary of the requested text amendments. Next slide, please. So the applicant is requesting text amendments to sections listed here. I'd note that the East Midtown proposal established this development framework, and the proposed text amendments are just tweaking it a little bit to accommodate a project of this scale, location, and level of public contribution. Next slide, please. 81644 is the transit improvement special permit, and the applicant is amending it to add extra clarity that improvements to a rail mass transit facility, such as Grand Central Terminal, can receive a bonus. Specifically, this makes it abundantly clear that the short loop intermodal connector qualifies as an eligible improvement under this section. And when we developed the East Midtown text, we wanted to give the flexibility for improvements of this type to be eligible. But we didn't actually anticipate that something as ambitious as the short loop would be on the table for a developer to undertake. Next slide, please. The applicant's amending section 81645 to give the commission the authority to modify bulk regulations to facilitate a public concourse's design. The applicant is requesting a waiver under this section to reduce the number of required loading bursts, which would facilitate the creation of the GRAYBAR terrace, and would allow the CHRYSLER terrace and Grand Central terrace to be connected as a single continuous open air public space. Next slide, please. Section 81685 specifies which zoning regulations the commission may modify with respect to qualifying sites in East Midtown. The applicant is looking to modify a series of regulations by special permit that are not currently covered by the existing text. This would allow the Grand Central Terminal zoning lot and development site zoning lot to be considered a single qualifying site. It would allow the proposed development to utilize special permit bonuses, even though the proposed development would not exceed 15 FAR. It would also allow the floor area bonuses from the transit improvement special permit and the public concourse special permit to be used in combination, each for up to a maximum of 3 FAR to facilitate major public improvements to both the below and above grade public realm. Next slide, please. Additionally, 81685 would be amended to allow a $38 million contribution to be made to the Public Realm Improvement Fund in connection with the transfer of unused Grand Central floor area. The text amendment would also require the applicant to obtain a harmonious relationship report from the LPC. LPC voted February 23rd, 2021 to provide a positive report to the CPC. Additionally, 81685 is being amended to allow for a single 10-year term to complete substantial construction prior to the lapse of the special permits as set forth in section 1142. Next slide, please. Lastly, the applicant is amending the definition of public realm improvement fund in section 81613 to allow their payment into the fund for the unused Grand Central floor area. Next slide, please. So I will briefly review a summarized version of the special permit findings. Next slide, please. Here's an abbreviated version of the findings pursuant to 81621. You can find the full findings in your briefing packet. To reiterate, the applicant's requesting the special permit to allow 406,000 square foot hotel with approximately 500 keys. The key findings here are that the hotel contains business-oriented amenities. Next slide, please. Here's an abbreviated version of the findings pursuant to 81644. You can find the full findings again in your briefing packet. The key findings here are that transit improvements will increase accessibility, security, connectivity, and vertical circulation, and that where possible, they'll be integrated into the development's footprint and will allow for daylighting and improved user orientation. Next slide, please. Here they are for 81645, and again, the full version is in the briefing packet. A key finding here is that the concourse be designed in a manner that combines separate spatial elements into a cohesive and harmonious site plan. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of the findings for 81685. Again, the full version is in the briefing packet. And some key findings here are that the proposed modifications will allow for a better site plan and will further the subdistrict's objectives of facilitating a new state-of-the-art sustainable class of office towers. Next slide, please. So lastly, I'll touch on the disposition action in the EIS. Next slide, please. So a quick note on the disposition. The ground lease that was negotiated as part of the 1977 GPP included a reversion clause. This means that in the event that the ground lease is amended and restated, as would be required to facilitate the proposed development, the property would revert from state to city ownership. Because of this reversion clause, a disposition action is required in order for the applicant to redevelop the property. Due to the disposition action, the building's overall design and the public spaces are also subject to PDC review. PDC held a conceptual hearing for this proposal on March 22nd, and then the next phase of their review will happen after the City Council stage of ULURP. DCP is working very closely with PDC on this matter. Also, in addition to the requested actions before you, the applicant is also applying for 2 chair certifications to reconfigure existing transit easement volumes on their site. These certifications are part of the current East Midtown regs. And the applicant is also pursuing a number of non-zoning approvals related to the amendment and restatement of the ground lease. Next slide, please. A draft EIS was prepared for the project, and DCP was the lead agency. There is a potential for transportation-related traffic, transit, and pedestrian impacts, as well as construction-related traffic and pedestrian impacts. Mitigation measures have been proposed for these impact categories, all of which is detailed in the DEIS materials published. Next slide, please. So here's where the presentation concludes, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ezra. I think we need to take just a pause just to have it all sink in. Questions from any commissioners? Commissioner Burney.
I don't really have questions yet, but just in terms of clarifications, and Ezra, that was quite a marathon presentation you gave us there, so compliments to you. I was a little unclear about what's happening with the TDR payments to the Public Realm Improvement Fund. Could you just explain that a little bit more? You said something about $61 a square foot, but where is that going, and what's the relationship with the price that was paid for the development rights by the developer?
For the price that was paid by the developer, I think that's probably a question best addressed at public hearing.
Oh, you don't know that, okay.
I don't know that, but I do know that the $61.49 per square foot is the minimum contribution currently for the for transfers in the East Midtown framework, and so it would be deposited into the public realm improvement fund, similar to like the transfer, for example, from 270 Park.
Right, but if I'm not mistaken, that's significantly lower than the TDR payments to the public realm improvement fund on previous projects, right?
I think it's relatively comparable with what 270 Park paid, and so that came out of our study about about what would be an appropriate minimum. And I guess hypothetically, if the developer pays more than a higher market rate for those development rights from themselves, it would be subject probably to the a similar type of contribution. But $61.49 is what we have existing in the text, and we thought would be appropriate here.
Okay.
I'll also note on that point that when 270 Park came through, we were very pleased that the actual amount paid, I believe, was within 10% of the minimum that we set.
Okay. And this is probably a different conversation, but at some point, I'd like to understand what's happening with the Public Realm Improvement Fund and what those funds are being used for and so on, but probably not today.
Certainly, we can provide an update at some future point on that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. On a day when our schedule isn't so jammed, we can do an update on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then the other thing is, and it's obviously staggeringly complicated project.
Commissioner Bernie, you're muted.
Yeah. I don't know how that happened. I was just saying, it's a staggeringly complicated project, and I think it's a miracle what they've been able to do below grade. It seems like most of those improvements are really beneficial. I'm not quite so sanguine about the terraces, and I think, as Ezra commented, we don't generally like the idea of elevated public terraces, and it worries me a little bit. I think in part of the text it said that the sort of opening hours, the hours of operation were yet to be determined. And one can just see that these being private terraces are not public terraces at all. And I noticed in some cases we have movable seating, in other cases we don't. The GRAYBAR terrace really just looks like a restaurant, doesn't really look like a public space. So I just have some concerns about whether those public spaces are really going to be all that public. But anyway, we can discuss that at a later date, I guess.
With regard to the hours, the department's position is that the spaces and open air public spaces in general should be open 24/7.
Yeah, well, that brings us to the enforcement question, as we need for all of our POPs, right? So, because nobody's there to take care of that actually happening, they get privatized de facto, and there's not a whole lot to be done about it. Oh, and the other question was, and this is like a kind of architect's question, there's no way to connect those elevated terraces with the upper level of the terminal. I'm just trying to think about what happens at that elevation within the terminal. There is an upper level within the terminal. It would make them much more publicly accessible if you could actually connect across the, come across the Park Avenue viaduct and connect to that public terrace, but I don't know whether that's feasible.
That's an interesting question. Were there to be no vehicular traffic on, the Park Avenue viaduct, theoretically, if they were able to exit at the upper levels, would be able to come across. The Grand Central Terrace does extend a little bit onto area that was formerly sidewalk for the Park Avenue viaduct, and actually transforms it into part of their plaza and allows for a very nice new view along the balustrade of the plinth.
Yeah, exactly. And, just finally, it's pretty staggering in this pandemic age that somebody's going to go out there and build 2.25 million square feet in an 85-story building. Somebody's optimistic, so we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Edith might want to follow up, but I think we're bullish on East Midtown, and we see this as New York's main CBD, and arguably the most iconic one in the world. And I mean, we've cited stats when we brought East Midtown before you that it's responsible for about 10% of the city's property tax revenue. So
Yeah.
You know, we view this as a proposal as a vote of confidence in East Midtown future. And, you know, we're pleased to see multiple levels of government cooperating to site the building, you know, where it should be on top of, you know, North America's most iconic transit hub. And hoping that the build year of 2029, the world will look very different, you know, than it does, you know, when this project opens doors.
Yeah, we can hope. Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Ortiz.
Commissioner, you're muted. Commissioner Ortiz, you're muted. I can see her talking. I can invite her to.
Commissioner Ortiz, I'm afraid you're muted. Commissioner Ortiz, you're muted. Perhaps the commissioner is on another call.
Perhaps.
Yeah, that could well be. Any other, let me check to see if there are other raised hands. Not seeing any. This application is certified. And how about after 4 presentations, 4 projects in 4 hours, we give Manhattan office a rest at this point. They've been a little bit busy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to the 5th item on our agenda. It's a certification of a UDOT designation and disposition of city-owned property and special permit in Bronx